In 1882, a man over 8 feet tall walked into a boarding house in rural Pennsylvania, paid for a room in cash, and told the innkeeper he'd been travelling for 3 straight months. The innkeeper, a man named Thomas Whitley, later described the stranger as impossibly large, with hands that could wrap completely around a dinner plate, and also a voice so deep it rattled the windows. 4 days later, the giant was dead. But before dying, he told Whitley something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A confession about the world that came before, about the structures we inherit, and about why certain truths were being systematically erased from public memory. If you're enjoying this investigation into forgotten history, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed narratives and alternative historical evidence every week. Now let's talk about what Thomas Whitley heard in that boarding house room. Thomas Whitley wasn't a historian. He was a practical man who ran a modest inn along the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad line, a route that connected coal towns to the industrial centres of the Northeast. His boarding house served miners, rail workers, and the occasional travelling merchant. In August of 1882, business was steady but unremarkable. That changed the moment the giant walked through his door. Whitley would later write in his private journal, which surfaced in a Pennsylvania estate sale in 1967, that the man had to duck nearly to his waist to clear the doorframe. He wore a long coat that looked custom-made, boots that seemed stitched from ox leather, and a hat he removed to reveal a head. Whitley wrote, quote, "large as a watermelon but perfectly proportioned." The giant paid for a week in advance in silver coins that Whitley noted were unusually heavy and stamped with markings he didn't recognize. He asked for the corner room on the second floor, the one with the reinforced bed frame Whitley had built for a logger who'd stayed there years earlier. The giant climbed the stairs slowly, and Whitley heard every step creak under the weight. That first night, Whitley's wife served dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, bread. The giant ate 4 full portions without speaking, nodded his thanks, and returned to his room. For 3 days the pattern repeated. The giant would descend for meals, eat in silence, and disappear upstairs. He never made eye contact. He never offered his name. On the 4th morning he didn't come down for breakfast. Whitley knocked on the door around noon. No answer. He knocked again, louder, and heard a faint groan from inside. When he opened the door, he found the giant collapsed on the floor beside the bed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Whitley called for his wife, and together they managed to get the man back onto the bed, though Whitley later admitted it felt like trying to move a felled tree. The giant's breathing was shallow, laboured. His skin had taken on a greyish tone. Whitley sent his son to fetch the town doctor, but the boy returned an hour later with news that the doctor was 20 miles north, tending to an outbreak of diphtheria in the mining camps. By the time the doctor could arrive, it would be too late. The giant seemed to know this. He opened his eyes, looked directly at Whitley, and began to speak. What he said, according to Whitley's journal, wasn't a request for help or a prayer. It was a confession. The giant said he'd been born in 1802, which would have made him 80 years old, though Whitley noted he looked no older than 50. He said his father had been one of the builders, a term he used without explanation, but with a tone, Whitley wrote, that suggested it carried weight. The giant said his father had worked on structures that no longer existed in public record. Great halls with ceilings 40 feet high, archways built to accommodate people of his size. Infrastructure designed for populations that had been, in his words, systematically reduced. He said the reduction began in earnest in the 1830s, coinciding with the rise of industrial labour models that required smaller, cheaper workers. He said the architecture was being dismantled or repurposed, and the people who remembered were being discouraged from speaking. Whitley asked what he meant by reduced. The giant said his people had once been common in certain regions, not anomalies, just another type of human being, suited to different labour and a different world. The world had been reorganised in the mid-19th century through economic redesign. Factories needed uniform workers. Railroads needed labourers who fit standardised sleeping quarters. People his size didn't fit the model. They were expensive, inefficient, so they were quietly marginalised until they disappeared. He told Whitley his father had been a mason who worked on old world buildings with features that seem over-engineered. High ceilings, oversized doorways, windows 12 feet off the ground. These weren't design flourishes, they were practical accommodations. His father had been hired to retrofit these buildings after the reorganisation. Lower the ceilings, narrow the doors, add second floors to cavernous single rooms. The work was called modernisation, but the real goal was erasure. If the buildings no longer suggested a different occupant, future generations wouldn't ask why they'd been built that way. Whitley pressed him on this. The giant shook his head. Not wiped out, he said, bred out. As industrial economies took hold, people of unusual size found it harder to marry, find work, survive. No laws against them, no mass violence, just gradual economic pressure that made existence unsustainable. Within 2 generations, they went from visible minority to forgotten anomaly. By the 1880s, people like him were so rare that when they appeared, they were treated as freaks, exhibited in circuses, studied by doctors as medical oddities rather than remnants of a recent past. He'd spent 3 months travelling to places his father had worked, documenting what remained. He'd visited a building in Philadelphia that had been a communal hall, now subdivided into 6-row houses. A church in upstate New York, where the original vaulted ceiling had been covered with a drop ceiling, leaving only 8 feet of clearance. A train station in Maryland, where ticket windows, originally built at shoulder height for men his size, had been lowered and remounted, with old bolt holes still visible in the stone. Everywhere he went, he found evidence of modification. Everywhere he went, people didn't question it. Whitley asked why he'd come here. The giant said he hadn't chosen it deliberately. He'd been travelling south and simply run out of strength. Months of walking, poor food, nights in barns because no inn would accommodate him without spectacle, had worn him down. He was dying not from disease, but exhaustion. His body, built for a world that no longer existed, couldn't sustain itself in the one that replaced it. He didn't expect Whitley to believe him. Most people didn't. But he wanted someone to know before the last of his kind were gone, and the story became impossible to reconstruct. Whitley asked if there were others. The giant said he'd met 3 in his lifetime. One died in a factory accident in Pittsburgh, crushed by machinery not designed for his dimensions. One joined a travelling show and drank herself to death by 40. One disappeared into the Western Territories. There might be a few more scattered across the country, maybe a dozen at most, but they were isolated, unconnected, aging out. Within 20 years, he said, there would be none left, and once gone the buildings would just be old buildings, the doorways just tall doorways. No one would think to ask why. Whitley sat with him for hours. The giant's breathing weakened, his voice dropped to a whisper. He talked about his father's frustration with undoing the craftsmanship he'd been trained to create, about his mother, who loved his father but struggled to understand why the world seemed to turn against them, about his childhood spent mostly indoors, hidden from neighbours who would treat him as a curiosity. He'd learned to read from old books his father salvaged from buildings being demolished, books with illustrations of people in clothes that looked nothing like 1880s fashion. Books referencing civic structures, aqueducts, energy systems that no longer appeared in contemporary engineering texts. His father said the books were from before the reorganization, but he'd never verified that. All he knew was the world described didn't match the world he lived in. By evening, the giant stopped talking. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling. Whitley later wrote that the man seemed to be studying the rafters, as if seeing something Whitley couldn't. Just before midnight, the giant took one last breath and was gone. Whitley didn't know what to do. He sent his son to notify the constable, but the constable didn't arrive until the next morning. When he did, he took one look at the body and said it would need to be examined by a medical authority. He said there were institutions in Philadelphia that studied cases like this. Whitley protested, said the man deserved a burial, not a dissection, but the constable insisted. 2 days later, a carriage arrived from the city and the giant's body was loaded into a wooden crate and taken away. Whitley never learned where it ended up. He wrote letters to the medical college in Philadelphia, to the constable's office, to the railroad company that ran the line. No one had records of a body matching that description. No one had records of a giant dying in rural Pennsylvania in August of 1882. Whitley kept the giant's belongings, the oversized coat, the boots, the silver coins. He kept his journal entry about the encounter private, shared it only with his wife, and never mentioned it publicly. In 1895, Whitley sold the boarding house and moved west. His journal remained in a trunk in his attic, passed down through 3 generations, until it surfaced in a 1967 estate sale, where a local historian purchased it along with a box of miscellaneous family papers. The historian, a man named Raymond Collier, recognized the significance of the entry and attempted to verify Whitley's account. He found property records confirming that Whitley had owned a boarding house along the Philadelphia and Reading line. He found census records listing Whitley's family, but he found no death certificate, no coroner's report, no medical examination records, and no mention of a giant in any local newspaper from August 1882. Collier did find something else. In the archives of a Philadelphia architectural firm that had been contracted to modernize several buildings along the rail corridor in the 1870s and 1880s, he found invoices for structural modifications that matched what the giant had described: ceiling reductions, door narrowing, window relocation. The invoices didn't explain why these modifications were necessary, only that they were part of a standardization initiative funded by a coalition of railroad and industrial interests. Collier also found building permits from the same period that referenced compliance with new municipal codes requiring maximum ceiling heights of 10 feet in residential construction, down from previous standards that had allowed for significantly taller spaces. He found no explanation for why the codes had changed. What the giant told Whitley lines up with patterns that appear across dozens of American cities in the mid to late 19th century. Buildings with features that seem impractical unless you assume a different type of occupant. Infrastructure that gets retrofitted, downsized, and recontextualized as urban populations explode, and industrial labor models take hold. If you walk through older districts in Philadelphia, Boston, or New York and look closely at pre-1880 construction, you'll find the same signs. Doorways that have been shortened with added frames, windows that sit higher than they should, staircases with risers that feel slightly too tall for modern use. Most people assume these are just quirks of old construction, design choices from a different era. But what if they're not quirks? What if they're remnants of a world that required them, a world that was methodically redesigned to fit a new economic model? The giant story, if true, suggests that the transition wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. It was funded, and it was thorough enough that within a single generation the physical evidence became ambiguous and the human evidence disappeared entirely. Whether you believe his account or dismiss it as the fevered ramblings of a dying man, the fact remains that someone told this story to Thomas Whitley in 1882, and Whitley believed it enough to write it down and keep it private for the rest of his life. That suggests he saw something in the man, or in the evidence around him, that made the story feel plausible. And if it was plausible to someone who lived through that period, who saw the buildings being modified and the population shifting, maybe it's worth asking why it feels implausible to us now. Maybe the implausibility is the point. The giant said his people were reduced, not eliminated, bred out through economic pressure, isolated and forgotten within 2 generations. If that's true, it would explain why there's no mass grave, no documented genocide, no historical record of their disappearance. They didn't disappear all at once. They faded one by one until the last of them were dying in boarding houses, with no one to carry the story forward except a man like Whitley, who had no reason to fabricate it and no incentive to publicize it. The question isn't whether giants existed. The question is whether the world we inherited was built for someone else, and whether the infrastructure we live in still carries traces of that earlier design.